I need to tell you about the $12,000 my mother-in-law spent trying to make sure my wedding day fell apart in front of everyone who mattered to her. I still have the recording. I've listened to it more times than I probably should admit, and every single time, I still can't quite believe how close she came to pulling it off. My name is Hannah. I'm a marketing coordinator, which means I spend my days managing timelines, vendors, and other people's expectations for a living. I mention that because it's exactly the skill set that ended up saving my own wedding in the end, even though I didn't realize I'd need it for anything more personal than a product launch. I met Ryan 3 years ago at a mutual friend's barbecue, and it was the kind of easy, uncomplicated connection you don't question too hard when you find it. He proposed on a Tuesday of all days in our own kitchen, no elaborate plan, just him getting down on one knee while I was still holding a spatula. I said yes before he even finished the sentence. The first real hint that something wasn't going to be simple came about 2 weeks later, at the dinner where I formally met his mother, Diane. She was polished in the way that takes real effort to maintain. Every hair in place, every compliment delivered with a small, precise edge to it. She told me warmly that she was so glad Ryan had found someone so down to earth. I remember smiling and thanking her, not quite registering in the moment that down to earth wasn't exactly a compliment coming from a woman who spent 20 years as an event coordinator for a luxury hotel chain and clearly still measured everyone by a very specific, very expensive standard. Diane asked about my family that night, my upbringing, where I went to school, what my parents did for work. Ordinary questions on their own. But she asked them the way you'd interview someone for a job they weren't quite qualified for. And by the end of the dinner, I had the distinct, hard-to-articulate feeling that I'd just been evaluated rather than welcomed. At one point, she asked what my father did for a living, and when I told her he'd spent 30 years working as an electrician, she paused just a beat too long before saying, "How practical." I remember laughing it off in the moment, the way you laugh off something that stings slightly more than it should. George, sitting beside her, gave me an apologetic half-smile that I didn't fully understand the significance of until much later. Once I realized how many years he'd spent quietly absorbing Diane's comments on other people's behalf. I told myself I was being sensitive. Meeting a future mother-in-law is stressful under the best circumstances. I gave her the benefit of the doubt, the same benefit of the doubt I'd end up giving her in various forms for the better part of a year. The guest list was the first real battleground. Ryan and I had planned a modest wedding, 120 guests, mostly our own friends and close family. Diane, without much discussion, began adding names, colleagues of Ryan's from the firm, business contacts of George's, people from her own old professional network, who I'd never once heard mentioned before the engagement. When I gently pushed back, she framed it entirely around Ryan's future. "These connections matter for his career," she said. "You'll thank me later." Ryan, uncomfortable with conflict the way some people are uncomfortable with heights, sided with keeping the peace rather than pushing back on his mother. Our guest list grew from 120 to over 200 before I fully understood how much control I'd quietly ceded. Then came the wedding planner. I'd already done my research, found a planner I liked, someone recommended by a coworker who'd used her for a wedding the year before. Diane insisted, instead, on hiring a man named Marcus Webb, someone from her old professional circle, presenting it as a generous wedding gift. "Marcus is the best in the business," she said. "I wouldn't trust anyone else with this." Something in her tone made it clear this wasn't really a suggestion. I agreed, mostly to avoid another fight I didn't think I could win, and mostly because I still, at that point, believed Diane's controlling tendencies came from a place of wanting things to go well, even if her methods were exhausting. The small mistakes started about 6 weeks into the planning process. A venue walkthrough that Marcus somehow missed entirely, requiring us to reschedule with a venue coordinator who seemed genuinely confused about the mix-up. A vendor contract for the florist that listed the wrong date, caught only because I happened to reread it carefully one night. A cake tasting where the flavor I'd specifically requested somehow wasn't available, replaced with something Diane happened to prefer instead. Then there was the seating chart incident, which in hindsight should have told me more than it did at the time. I'd spent an entire weekend carefully arranging tables to make sure old friends sat together, to keep certain distant relatives comfortably apart, to make sure my own parents felt like honored guests rather than an afterthought at their own daughter's wedding. When Marcus sent over the finalized version 2 weeks later, half my careful arrangements had been quietly rearranged. My parents moved to a table near the back. Several of Diane's business contacts relocated to prime seats near the head table instead. When I asked about it, Marcus apologized profusely, blamed a software glitch during the export process, and promised to fix it immediately. He did fix it, but it was the third or fourth time in a row that a glitch happened to specifically undo something I'd arranged myself, and never once undid anything Diane had requested. Each mistake on its own was explainable. Wedding planning is chaotic. Vendors make errors. I chalked it up to Marcus being overwhelmed, or simply not as detail-oriented as his reputation suggested. My sister Sophia didn't buy it for a second. Sophia is a high school teacher, which means she spent a career developing an almost supernatural ability to tell when someone's lying to her. She came to several of the planning meetings with me, technically as my maid of honor, but really, I think, because she'd started noticing something I hadn't yet let myself see clearly. Every single mistake, she said to me one night after a meeting, sitting cross-legged on my couch with a legal pad covered in notes she'd apparently been keeping without telling me, happens to specifically undo something you picked without Diane's input. Have you noticed that? She flipped the pad around to show me. She'd actually listed them out, chronologically, next to a second column noting whether each mistake happened to align with something Diane had originally wanted instead. Every single line matched. Sophia, this could just be coincidence, I said, though even as I said it, I could hear how thin it sounded out loud. 6 coincidences in a row, all breaking the same direction, she said, raising an eyebrow. I teach 16-year-olds who lie to me every single day. Hannah. I know what a pattern looks like when I see one. I hadn't been ready to hear it yet, not consciously. But once she said it out loud, laid out in her own careful handwriting, I couldn't stop noticing it either. I still didn't want to believe it was deliberate. I told Sophia she was being overprotective, reading too much into ordinary wedding stress. She let it go for the moment, though I could tell she wasn't actually convinced, and I could tell, even then, some part of me wasn't either. About 2 months before the wedding, I overheard something that planted the first real seed of doubt. I'd stopped by the venue to drop off some paperwork and found Marcus on his phone in the parking lot, his back to me, voice low. I only caught a fragment before he noticed me and ended the call abruptly. We just need to keep this between us, he was saying. I'll handle the arrangement on my end. I didn't know what to make of it. It could have been about any client, any arrangement completely unrelated to me. But something about the way he startled when he saw me, the way he changed the subject a little too quickly afterward, sat uneasily in my stomach for days. I brought my concerns to him directly not long after, gently, careful not to accuse him of anything specific, since I genuinely didn't know what I'd be accusing him of. He was reassuring in that smooth, professional way vendors are trained to be. Weddings are always chaotic in the middle, he said. I promise you, everything will be perfect on the day itself. I wanted to believe him. I mostly did at the time. The moment that finally cracked my denial open happened at a family gathering about 6 weeks before the wedding. I'd stepped out of the kitchen to get something from the car and, coming back in, heard Diane's voice through the open window, talking to a cousin I barely knew. I just want to make sure the wedding reflects the family standards, she was saying, her voice carrying the particular warmth she used when she thought she was being generous rather than controlling. I've handled a few things behind the scenes to make sure of it. I stood frozen by that window for a long moment, turning those words over. Handled a few things, behind the scenes. It wasn't a confession, not exactly, but it was close enough to one that I couldn't unhear it. I told Sophia everything that night, including the parking lot phone call and the overheard comment. This time, she didn't let it go. Within a week, she'd done some digging of her own and found an old industry review, buried a few pages deep in a search, connecting Marcus's name to the same luxury hotel chain Diane had worked for 2 decades earlier. They'd worked together for years, a connection neither of them had ever mentioned, Despite Diane presenting Marcus as some independent recommendation rather than an old professional colleague, she clearly still had influence over. Why would she hide how well she actually knows him? Sophia asked, and I didn't have an answer that didn't make my stomach turn. I confronted Diane directly a few days later, laying out everything. The guest list, the vendor mix-ups, the phone call, the connection to Marcus she'd never disclosed. She didn't deny any of it outright. Instead, she reframed every single piece of it as help I should have been grateful for. I recommended Marcus because he's excellent at his job, she said, her voice even and reasonable, the tone of someone entirely convinced of her own generosity. I've made a few suggestions to vendors because I have decades of experience you don't have. I don't understand why you're treating my help like it's some kind of attack. You never mentioned you and Marcus worked together for years, I said. Why hide that? It didn't seem relevant, she said, waving a hand as if brushing away a minor inconvenience. I recommend people I trust. That's all this is. And the seating chart? The florist contract? The cake flavor? Mistakes happen during weddings, Hannah, she said, her voice taking on a faint, patient edge, the tone of someone explaining something obvious to a child. I'd think, given how important this day is to Ryan's professional future, you'd want someone experienced helping make sure everything reflects well on the family. Ryan was there for that conversation, and I watched him struggle, visibly, to figure out where he stood. Maybe you're reading too much into normal wedding stress, he finally said, not unkindly, but in a way that landed like a small betrayal anyway. It was the first time since we'd gotten engaged that I felt genuinely alone in this relationship, like I was fighting a battle he wasn't fully willing to stand beside me in. I didn't say much else that night. I went home, sat with Sophia on my couch, and let myself feel, for the first time, the full weight of what might actually be happening here. Marcus called me privately about 10 days later, asking to meet away from the venue, away from Diane, somewhere we could talk without anyone overhearing. I remember driving to that coffee shop with my hands tight on the steering wheel, genuinely unsure whether I was about to hear my wedding was falling apart or something else entirely. What he told me changed everything. 3 months before our wedding, Diane had approached him privately, he said, and offered him $12,000 beyond his normal fee. In exchange, she wanted him to introduce a series of small, deniable failures into the wedding day itself. Lighting problems during the reception, a cake delivery delayed just long enough to cause visible embarrassment, a microphone that would mysteriously cut out during our vows, at exactly the moment that mattered most. She wanted it to look like bad luck, Marcus said, watching my face carefully. Nothing anyone could ever prove was deliberate. Just enough small disasters, stacked together, to make sure your wedding day felt like a disappointment. To you, to Ryan's colleagues, to everyone she'd invited who mattered to her. I sat there for a long moment, feeling something between rage and a strange, cold clarity settle over me at the same time. How specific was the plan? I finally asked, was this just a vague conversation, or something more detailed than that? Marcus reached into his bag and pulled out a small notebook, flipping to a page covered in his own careful handwriting. She had a list, he said. Timing for the cake delay, down to the minute. A specific song she wanted the DJ to play during what she called a natural pause in the reception, something sentimental enough that its interruption by a stage technical issue would feel especially cruel. She'd clearly thought about this for a while before she ever brought it to me. Why are you telling me this? I finally asked, instead of just taking the money and doing it, or just refusing and walking away. Marcus set his phone on the table between us, because the moment she offered me that money, I understood exactly what kind of situation I was in. If I refused outright, she'd simply find someone else, someone with less to lose professionally, someone who wouldn't think twice. If I agreed and did nothing, eventually she'd notice and replace me anyway. So I agreed to the arrangement outwardly, and I've recorded every single conversation with her since that very first offer. He played me a portion of it right there in that coffee shop. Diane's voice, unmistakable, calmly discussing the specifics of the microphone failure, the cake delay, the lighting issues, like she was planning a corporate event rather than sabotaging her own son's wedding. At one point on the recording, she laughed lightly and said something about how brides these days are so sensitive. She'll assume it's just bad luck and move on. Hearing that particular laugh, so casual, so certain of getting away with it, was somehow worse than hearing the sabotage plan itself. I don't think I fully exhaled until the recording ended. Why 15 years in this business, and you've never done this before? I asked him once I trusted my voice again. Recorded a client like this, because I've never had a client offer to pay me to hurt someone, Marcus said simply. There's a difference between a difficult mother-in-law and what she asked me to do. I needed proof, both to protect myself professionally if this ever came out, and because, frankly, I didn't think it was right to let her get away with it. I made a decision in that coffee shop that I still think, to this day, was the right one. I told Marcus I didn't want to cancel the wedding, and I didn't want to confront Diane immediately either. I wanted the wedding to proceed exactly as planned, beautifully, without a single one of her sabotage attempts actually succeeding, and I wanted to choose, on my own terms, exactly when and how the truth would come out. Marcus agreed completely. For the next 10 days, he quietly rerouted every failure Diane believed was in motion. The lighting technician she thought she'd arranged to have technical difficulties was replaced, subtly, with someone Marcus trusted completely. The cake delivery she'd arranged to be delayed arrived exactly on schedule, through a backup vendor Marcus had lined up without her knowledge. And the sound technician for the ceremony microphones was someone Marcus vetted personally, someone with absolutely no connection to whatever arrangement Diane believed was still active. The wedding day itself was, against every odd Diane had tried to stack against it, close to perfect. I remember standing in the bridal suite that morning, going through hair and makeup, catching myself glancing at the clock every so often, wondering which small disaster was supposed to be happening at that exact moment, and feeling a strange, private satisfaction every time nothing did. The florist arrangements arrived exactly on schedule, arranged precisely the way I'd originally requested. Nothing swapped out or subtly altered. The seating chart Marcus handed the venue staff that morning matched, table for table, the version I'd spent that entire weekend carefully arranging months earlier. During the ceremony itself, I watched the sound technician, someone Marcus had personally vetted, with no connection whatsoever to whatever arrangement Diane believed was still quietly unfolding, check the microphones twice before we walked down the aisle, then a third time just before the officiant began. My vows came through clear and steady, not a single crackle or dropout, at exactly the moment Diane had specifically paid to have ruined. I remember watching Diane throughout the ceremony and reception, and the longer the day went smoothly, the more visibly unsettled she became. She kept checking her phone. She kept glancing toward the lighting booth, toward the kitchen, toward the sound equipment, waiting for something that never happened. When the cake was wheeled out precisely on schedule, 3 tiers exactly as ordered, I watched her expression flicker, just for a second, into something close to panic before she smoothed it back into practiced composure. By the time the reception was in full swing, she looked less like a woman enjoying her son's wedding and more like someone watching a plan quietly, inexplicably fall apart around her. At one point, during the father-daughter dance, I caught Diane's eye across the room. She was watching my own father spin me gently across the floor, both of us laughing at some small misstep, and for just a moment, her expression wasn't calculating at all. It was something closer to genuine confusion, like she couldn't understand why the day kept refusing to go according to her design. At one point, I watched her pull Marcus aside near the edge of the dance floor, her expression tight with barely controlled fury. I couldn't hear what she said to him, but I didn't need to. Marcus told me afterward exactly how that conversation went. She asked me why nothing had gone wrong, he said. Word for word, she said, "What happened to our arrangement, Marcus?" I told her the arrangement was over, and I told her everything had been recorded from the very first conversation we ever had about it. I watched her go pale right there on the dance floor. Hannah, I don't think I've ever seen someone's composure disappear that fast in 15 years of doing this job. I chose my moment carefully after that. Not a public scene, not something that would humiliate her in front of 200 guests who genuinely had nothing to do with any of this. I found Ryan and George quietly near the edge of the reception hall, away from the crowd, and I asked them both to step outside with me for a moment. Ryan's face shifted from confusion to concern the moment he saw my expression. "What's wrong?" he asked. "Is everything okay?" "Everything's fine," I told him. "But there's something you both need to hear, and I need you to hear it now, before this night is over." We stood in a quiet hallway near the coat check, the muffled sound of music and conversation drifting through the closed doors behind us. I played them the recording. Not the whole thing, just enough. Diane's voice, calm and precise, discussing exactly how she intended to make my wedding day fall apart, piece by piece, in ways designed to look accidental. The cake delay, the lighting, the microphone, specifically timed to fail during our vows. I watched Ryan's face change in real time, the same way I imagined mine had changed in that coffee shop days earlier. Disbelief first, then something closer to grief. He didn't say anything for almost a full minute, just stood there holding my phone with the recording paused on the screen, staring at nothing in particular. George, beside him, had gone very quiet, his jaw working the way people's jaws work when they're absorbing something they'd half suspected, but never wanted confirmed. "That's her voice," Ryan finally said, quietly. Not a question, just a fact he was forcing himself to accept out loud. "She actually paid someone to do this. To us. On our wedding day." "I'm so sorry," I said, and I meant it even in that moment, because some part of me still ached for the version of this day he'd wanted to have with his mother, the version where none of this was true. He found his mother a few minutes later, pulling her aside near the coat check, away from the main reception. I wasn't in the room for that exact conversation, but George was, and he told me afterward what happened. "You're not welcome to stay," Ryan told her, "unless you can explain right now, honestly, exactly what you did and why." Diane tried, at first, to reframe it the same way she had with me weeks earlier. Help, guidance, protecting the family standards. "I only wanted the day to reflect well on this family," she said. "On you. On your future. By paying someone $12,000 to ruin it," Ryan said, his voice shaking now, no longer the careful, conflict-avoidant tone I'd grown used to over 3 years together. "By making sure my vows to my wife got interrupted on purpose? How exactly was that protecting anything?" There was no reframing a recording of her own voice discussing a bribe for deliberate sabotage. Even Diane, for all her composure, couldn't talk her way around that. She tried anyway, for a few more minutes, according to George, offering variations on the same defense, each one thinner than the last, until she finally just stopped talking altogether and stood there, silent, in a hallway she'd probably imagined very differently when she woke up that morning. It was George, finally, who ended it. In 38 years of marriage, according to Ryan, his father had never once countermanded Diane in front of another person. That night he did. "It's time to go, Diane," George said, quietly but firmly, in front of their son, in front of the coat check attendant, in front of anyone close enough to hear. "You've done enough tonight." She left without another word. I don't know what that drive home looked like for the two of them, and honestly, I've never asked. The rest of the reception continued, mostly undisturbed, mostly unaware that anything significant had even happened. Most of our guests never knew, and I've kept it that way deliberately. This was never about humiliating Diane publicly. It was about making sure Ryan finally saw his mother clearly enough to choose, decisively, to protect what we were building together. In the months since, Ryan's relationship with Diane has settled into something careful and limited. He calls her occasionally, brief conversations that rarely go beyond logistics and pleasantries. She's seen us for a handful of supervised, brief visits, always with some distance maintained that wasn't there before. Never alone with just Ryan, never at our home without advance notice, never involved in any decision that matters to our life together. I don't know if that will ever fully change, and I've made my peace with the possibility that it might not need to. Some boundaries, once necessary, are worth keeping exactly as firm as the moment that created them. George, interestingly, has become someone I feel closer to now than I ever expected to. He calls occasionally too, just to check in, sometimes alone, without Diane on the line at all. I think in his own quiet way, drawing that one line at the coat check gave him permission to draw a few more since then, small ones, the kind of accumulated boundary setting that comes easier once you've proven to yourself you're capable of it at all. He came to visit us alone last month, something that would have been unthinkable a year ago, and we spent an afternoon talking about nothing in particular, the kind of easy conversation I think he'd been quietly craving for decades without knowing how to ask for it. Sophia still brings up the seating chart incident sometimes, half joking, asking if I ever planned to thank her properly for being the one who first said out loud what I'd been too afraid to admit to myself. I tell her I thank her every time I think about how differently that day could have gone if she hadn't pushed me to look closer. She just laughs and says that's what sisters are for, though I think we both know it was more than that. It was someone believing me before I fully believed myself. I think about that recording sometimes and about how close Diane came to getting exactly what she wanted, a wedding day quietly, deniably ruined, just convincing enough to feel like bad luck rather than sabotage. What she never counted on was hiring a planner principled enough to protect himself by protecting the truth instead. And what she really never counted on was that the same recording she thought would stay buried forever would end up being the thing her own son used to finally, permanently, choose me. Marcus still sends us a card every anniversary, a small tradition that started the year after our wedding and has continued ever since. Last year's simply read, "Glad the arrangement failed." I keep it in a drawer with the wedding invitations and the folded program from that day. Small proof that sometimes the person you least expect to protect you turns out to be exactly the ally you needed most. She spent $12,000 trying to make sure my wedding day fell apart in front of everyone who mattered to her. She just never imagined that the recording of her own voice would be the thing that finally did.